Okay, so let's get to the Sony Z7 Mark II. And when I've heard these on IFA 2018 this year, I have to say that actually the first thing that impressed me quite a lot was the big open wide soundstage that I just did not expect to be so close to something like a Z1R. But I also have to say, at least in my case, the presentation there was a little bit misleading for me, since I'm not used to such high-end gear, high-end player and high-res files, because I don't usually use these on a daily basis. So when I got it here, using it with my NFB 1128, things just didn't sound as spectacular anymore, which shows that it does scale, but also when I know from experience how other headphones that I have here sounded on way higher end gear, that was just the thing. So if you have something better, they will sound better, but also the longer I've used them, the more I just found things to be not as great as I hoped they would be. But before that, let's check what's in the box, which is also pretty much the carrying case, because these are made for home use, so you don't get something on its own. You can store them here pretty safely, absolutely. You get a 1.2 meter long balanced cable and a 3 meter long cable that ends with, as you can see on one end, with 3.5 millimeters and with the adapter at a 1/4 inch. The cable quality itself I actually like quite a lot, because we got this kind of ripped texture that is still very, very flexible, feels very good, but doesn't tangle up, so I definitely like that a lot. On the other end, it ends with those screwable plugs, as you can see here. This is either good or bad, because that's secure, but in case you maybe get stuck somewhere and you want it to rip out, that's not a thing, so just keep that in mind. But other than that, I like it. What I also like is that it kind of splits into two pieces quite late, so I had no issues here. So overall, I really like the cable quite a lot. Now about the design and build quality, what I don't care about if this is real leather or anything like that. I mean, it just has to feel good and feel done well, and they definitely did execute it really nicely. I mean, it costs 800 euros and it maybe doesn't feel, due to being so lightweight, for me at least, like something 800 euros, but I can't knock the execution because there are no sharp edges. Everything feels very smooth, very high quality, very soft, and they did a really nice job here. What's a little bit odd is, for example, the headband, because here it starts with 1, and on the other side, as you can, if you can see that, it starts with a 3. I'm not quite sure about that, but the headband itself works nice. It's stiff enough. It does definitely change on its own, and it's precise enough to give you enough of a wiggle room to position it the way you want it to. Now on the top, it's very soft, but you will feel the headband because of the clamping force, but I'll get into that in a second. Also here, the plugs kind of go towards in front of you, so they didn't bother me, which is also the case for the ear pads, because I have to say they are definitely big enough in terms of the cutout, because my ears did not touch, besides maybe in terms of depth, because if you are someone like me who usually has an issue on one ear that it touches, like for example pretty much on every headphone on my right ear, that was a case. A little bit less though than on many others, because here it's a little bit thicker, and it is very soft. It's not really memory foam though, but it feels also very smooth, and especially with the good clamping force, it offers a very good seal, because that's the highlight here in some way in terms of the comfort and design. They feel very lightweight and they feel kind of casual, because for example on the Amaron Home, I complained about the fact that they are too loose and they kind of dangle on your head, and even though these don't have a lot of clamping force and therefore you still feel some weight on the headband, which is not an issue though, because it's still after all quite soft, but they kind of tuned it so nice with the soft pads that the seal is absolutely there and that they are absolutely secure on your head and they fit just right. So I definitely like that a lot, because you could wear them for hours and hours, and actually the soft leather allowed for quite some breathing, so they weren't all that hot. Since they're closed, obviously after a while it could happen, and it's now winter, so I can't really judge that much based on heat, but they felt quite good because you still have quite some breathing room inside. So pretty nice job done here. Also the isolation is pretty good, I have to say. That leakage actually is though a little bit more than some other ones, which brings me to how easy they are to power. And like I said, on IFA they had high-end gear and it definitely scaled and sounded better than it does with my NFB 1128, but with 100 dB sensitivity and 56 ohms, they are still very easy to power. I mean, I wouldn't do it with a phone, and if you want something especially as expensive and high-end like this, you will have an kind of matching headphones. But let's get to the sound now and start off with the Soundstage, which is kind of the highlight for me, at least in some ways, because it's so wide. It's not really open, or at least airy, but it's wide and feels quite open up to a certain point, because there are no kind of boundaries that you feel. And especially for games like when I played shooters or also racing games, it felt very natural, because you felt like exactly how big it should be. And I mean, the imaging is not that great. It suffers a little bit from this wide soundstage, because on games I could locate where enemies are, but I couldn't quite feel how close they are like I can do on some other cans. So that is maybe a little bit of a drawback, but it felt very natural and it felt really nice, and you were pretty immersed in the experience also for racing games and so on. It felt better than on some others where I actually usually prefer a little bit more intimacy. Now about the sound signature, these definitely are sounded. They are V-shaped, the bass is elevated and the highs are elevated, which is not a bad thing though. I mean, if you want something super accurate, natural and flat, then there are other headphones out there. So this would be maybe the closest comparable to something like an Amaron Home. But definitely different because it's also closed back and so on, but that's not so much the thing. But the thing is that these are, I would say, for pretty actually casual listening or kind of chilled out listening, because they are not really edgy, they are kind of smooth, balanced also quite nicely, but they are definitely sounded. Because when we get to the bass, I have to say, even though bass is boosted, it's not nearly as much as I expected it to be, because it has more bass. But it's a pretty soft bass, and I wouldn't actually call it punchy at all. I would call it more like thumping, because especially in the mid bass segment, the main bass segment, it doesn't have the force behind it. I mean, you feel more of a wave coming to you instead of a punch. Where you get a little bit more punches in the kick bass area. Sub bass, though, I have to say, is actually pretty good, because there it still has a lot of force. I mean, resolution is not that great and it's not super detailed, but it's a nice, pleasant bass that doesn't drown into the mids, which obviously due to the elevated bass are a little bit recessed. But what's actually maybe a little bit more of an issue for me, that also has to do with the soundstage in general with the reset mids, is that vocals sound very distant. And I mean, I also said it already so many times that I like if vocals are a little bit closer, a little bit more intimate and a little bit forward in terms of the instruments. What happens here though is you kind of have a dead zone, because the instruments always seem to come from here, and you have this kind of spot and you go to, but from the front only the vocals come in. I mean, you want the vocals from the front, but they sound very distant, and sometimes, especially in this area to the front, a little bit disconnected from the instruments, which just feels a little bit odd. So it wasn't quite a coherent experience. So I would personally wish for something that is just a little bit tighter together with better imaging, because just instruments from the sides and vocals felt a little bit odd, because you still want vocals to instruments to also sound a little bit from the front, which was a little bit less the case here. Now the highs, I have to say, I like these quite a lot, because they are quite soft with a hard roll-off at the end, but they go up to a point where you don't think like you are missing too much out on details. They are definitely not sharp, not sibilant or anything like that, so very pleasing, but they feel open and airy enough so you can get a pretty nice experience with the bass that is elevated. But therefore, like I said, the mids suffer. And if I would compare this, for example, to something like an Odyssey LCD2 closed, which is pretty similar in terms of price, they were definitely way more neutral and way leaner, kind of thinner in some way, and definitely not comparable to these. So the closest thing that I have actually here that is closed would be the 1060C, which, I mean, have just a nicer bass, way more intimate in still vocals, and just more details. The resolution feels finer, which is the odd thing, because these cost 800 euros, and I'm not gonna say that they feel cheaper just because they feel lightweight. I mean, the comfort is great, and it's not that easy to find the higher end headphone that is so lightweight and comfortable. But when it just comes to the sound, and if I would have to base my judgment on that, having used it for about, I think, 3 or 4 weeks by now, I would judge them like maybe 400, not 800, because I still like them a lot, because I don't always want to listen to something super accurate and something super flat, because that's sometimes a little bit boring, especially some certain music. I just want to be a little bit sounded, and then these do the job, but I don't like it, I think, 800 euros much. I would say 400, because they have advantages over something like the 1060C with the lightweightness and also due to the better comfort. But when it just comes to the sound, these are a little bit too heavy, especially if I would compare it to something like LCD2C closed, which is just way more accurate. But or even, let's say, the Amaron Home, which is open back, so not quite comparable, but that one has just more resolution. It has the faster, more responsive bass. It has the tighter bass. It has higher, for some people, a little bit sharper, but more detailed highs, and the mids weren't all that recessed, and especially the distant vocals were what put me off a little bit, because at first, and on certain more mainstream music, more like pop music and also female vocals, it wasn't all that obvious. But I listen to a lot of rock, metal and such music, and there you just notice that music that feels a little bit more advanced in my opinion, that has just more details and that just shouldn't be all that wide, it feels off, because then it sounded more like it didn't work out so well. So if you use more like classic music works okay, but if it's more like mainstream music, and that's kind of the typical Sony sound, they always tune their sound for mainstream people, so a nice fun sound, and I would still call this in some way an audiophile fun sounded headphone that does a good job, and it definitely works way better than on more advanced music like classical music, ballads, bass heavy music works quite good, even though like I said, it's not more, if you want a lot of punch, that's not what you will get. But rock, metal and so on feels good, but it just doesn't sound as I'm used to it from other headphones. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you have any further questions, just leave them down below. Otherwise, once again, very nice, and I like them for what they are in certain situations, but 800 is a little bit too much. Okay, until next time, bye.